Thanks for joining us on CBSN Minnesota. I'm Erin Hassanzadeh. Tonight marks the 7th night of protests in Brooklyn Center. The gatherings all week long have been in protest of the deadly police shooting of Daunte Wright. This is a live look from our Sky 4 chopper zoomed just over the Brooklyn Center Police Department, where we have seen crowds gathering for 7 days and nights now outside of the police center there. You can see quite a good sized crowd. And we're going to check in on the ground there in just a moment. A reminder, Brooklyn Center has a curfew that goes into effect at 11 tonight. Our David Schuman has been at that protest for a couple of hours now. And we checked in with you an hour ago, David. Has the crowd grown a little bit?
It absolutely has. This crowd has grown, and it is growing. If you thought 7 nights of this, people would lose steam and stop coming out, that does not appear to be the case tonight. Operation Safety Net actually tweeted a bit earlier that they have 200 protesters out here. And just looking at this crowd, I'd say that probably is about accurate. I want to show you how it's grown. Earlier when we talked, there was no one really in the street. They were mostly across the street. Now there are enough people here to fill up this entire space. They are up against the fence, but there's nothing going on with shaking the fence. As far as I can tell, there isn't too much yelling. This actually has a very calm atmosphere. It's a calm atmosphere that almost at times can feel a little bit like a party because you have music playing. There are still people grilling out from the afternoon. The people that have left, I can tell you, are people who, A, are nervous about what happened last night and they don't want to see that happen again. And B, there were families here with children. And I spoke to a father with 4 young kids below the age of 13. He said that it was important to him to bring his kids out here, show them what this is all about, what fighting for justice looks like, he said. But of course, now that it is dark, they left. But if you walk around, you see chalk drawings on the ground. A lot of that was done by his kids. Earlier, some notable people we've seen, Jesse Jackson was here, and he was walking through the crowd, hugging people, embracing people in the community. And I would describe it as a bit of a magnetic presence that Jesse Jackson had. He just accumulated people around him as he made his way through. And the other person I've spoken to is Damon Bryant, who is Daunte Wright's brother. I asked him, what are you out here for? What do you want to see happen? He immediately said, without hesitation, a murder charge, which we know there was a large group of protesters in Stillwater outside the Washington County Attorney's house demanding the same thing. Officer Kim Potter only charged with manslaughter at the moment. These protesters would like to see a greater charge levied against her.
And yeah, you mentioned Reverend Jesse Jackson making his way through the crowd. We know that Reverend Al Sharpton is going to give Daunte Wright's eulogy at his upcoming funeral. And I think, David, it just speaks to how central, our metro area is, not in, calls for justice in these cases, but beyond it, for national reforms, really.
Yeah, you have this going on simultaneously with the Derek Chauvin trial. And we hear this phrase, all eyes on Minnesota, and it sounds almost cliche, but right now it really is true. I mean, after last summer, the way the protests after George Floyd's death set off this worldwide movement, and here we're having this again, this sustained energy for this protest movement. And Minnesota really, cliche, like I said, cliche, but all eyes are on here. And these protesters, I think, are aware of that. They know that their message is being heard around the world.
Question for you about police presence tonight. What are you seeing in the way of law enforcement? Do we still have that double barricade in front of the police station? And are we seeing National Guard or state police out at all?
Yeah, so I'm going to step aside to show you. We have this double fence here, which is creating a gap between the protesters and the law enforcement, who it might be a little too dark to see, are further back standing by the building, the police department. And right here, though, there's chains on the fence. You can see, because last night, that is where protesters got through this first fence. They yanked it off, it looks like, and they got through, and that sort of escalated tensions. I guess they are trying to prevent that from happening again. But right now, we're gonna turn to our left here. Protesters, yes, are standing up against the fence, but not really doing much with it. And there are, you mentioned it earlier actually, but there are these large sheriff's vehicles in the yard in front of the police department. So it is a little hard to get a visual on the law enforcement officers, and that could be keeping things calm. But we saw last night how quickly things can change, and they might change any minute. But right now, it does feel relatively calm out here. People are grilling out, like I said before, and dancing a little bit. You can hear that music. So right now we'll see. We're going to see how things go out here.
Sure. And one more question, but David, before we let you go, you did that story earlier this week that got such a reaction. The people who are living in this area, across from the police department, they found themselves also in the center of just all the activity outside of their homes, for better or for worse. Have you checked in with anyone, or do you see anyone looking out their windows tonight as they're on, night 7 of having this just outside their window?
Yeah, seems to be always a lot of people in that doorway to build in one of the buildings across the street, and that is because they feel like they have to protect their building. They were upset this week that tear gas was being fired at their doorstep, getting into their apartments, but they made it clear to me that they felt both the police and the protesters were in the wrong. The police for firing tear gas, but the protesters for running towards their building and even in some cases trying to get in for shelter. They were saying, why would you run toward our building when you know there are families here and you know that you are having tear gas and rubber bullets fired in your direction? So they are just in a lose-lose situation in many ways. They're not happy. A lot of people on Twitter were very generous and said, we're trying to raise funds to get those people that live in these apartments in the hotels for a week, get them out of their houses. But I brought up that possibility with one of the people who lives there, and he said, I don't want to leave because he's worried that if no one's in the building will get looted and people will come in. And so he's sitting at the doorway to protect his building, make sure no one gets in, and hopefully keep the children as far away from some of these tactics that we've seen police use earlier in the week to disperse crowds.